"Excuse me, sir. There's an error in your third equation." Marcus Whitfield did not turn around at first. He let the silence sit, the way he let markets sit before he crushed them. Then he turned, slow, deliberate, a man who had never once in 48 years been corrected by someone holding a water pitcher. A waitress, correcting him. In front of 40 of the wealthiest people in New York, he looked her up and down, the black apron, the name tag that read Nadia, the small chip in her front tooth she never bothered to fix because fixing it cost money she didn't have. "Sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the room, "I don't think they let people like you take math at whatever school you dropped out of." A woman near the ice sculpture laughed into her champagne. Someone's phone came up, already recording. "I dare you," Whitfield said, stepping closer, close enough that Nadia could smell the cognac on his breath. "Solve it. Right here. $10 million, if you're right. And if you're wrong, you clean out your locker before your shift ends. Deal." Nadia Coleman set the water pitcher down on the linen tablecloth, careful, quiet, the way she'd set down every burden in her life. Nobody in that ballroom had any idea what was about to happen to Marcus Whitfield. Least of all, Marcus Whitfield. The Argenta was not a restaurant. It was a courtroom disguised as a dining room, 40 floors above Park Avenue, where Manhattan's finance elite came to remind each other, and everyone who served them, exactly where they stood in the order of things. The chandeliers alone cost more than a house in the Bronx. The tasting menu ran $420 a head, before wine, and the wine started at $300. The staff moved through the room like furniture that happened to breathe. Trained never to be noticed, never to be heard, never, under any circumstance, to speak first. Nadia had worked there for 3 years and 8 months. She was 27 years old. She had been invisible for most of her life, and she had gotten very good at it. Her mother, Dorothy Coleman, died of pancreatic cancer when Nadia was 16. No insurance. The hospital in the Bronx sent bills that ate through everything the family had. The apartment on Tremont Avenue. The used Honda, the wedding ring Dorothy, had kept in a coffee can under the sink for 22 years. Nadia dropped out of Evander Childs High School 3 months before graduation to work 2 jobs. Her younger brother, Marcus, no relation, a cruel coincidence of naming that Nadia never told a soul about, was 11 then, and someone had to make sure he ate dinner. Someone had to make sure the lights stayed on in a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor with no elevator. So Nadia carried trays. She scrubbed grease traps at a diner on Fordham Road for $4.50 an hour under the table. And every night, after her brother fell asleep on the pull-out couch, she sat on the kitchen floor with library books stacked around her like a fortress. Real analysis, linear algebra, topology, probability theory borrowed from 3 different branches because no single library had enough. She watched university lecture recordings on a phone with a screen so cracked it looked like a spider web. The sound turned low so it wouldn't wake her brother. She filled a 90-cent composition notebook, front to back with proofs, then flipped it upside down and filled it again backward, because notebooks cost money and she had none to spare. No degree, no tutor, no classroom, just a mind that refused to stop moving, and a stubbornness that refused to let a wrong answer sit unfixed anywhere in the world, even when the wrong answer wasn't hers to fix. Nobody at the Argenta knew any of that. To them, Nadia was the quiet one who refilled glasses and never spoke unless spoken to. The head chef called her the shadow. The sommelier once told a table of investors, within earshot, that she probably thought a Bordeaux was a car. She heard it. She heard everything. She never said a word. Until tonight. Tonight, the Argenta had been rented out entirely, $600,000 for the private room, and the 2 camera crews, for an event Marcus Whitfield had spent 11 months planning. Whitfield Dynamics Capital, $41 billion under management, was launching what Whitfield called the Sentinel model, a proprietary algorithm his team of 11 PhDs, recruited from Princeton, Caltech, and the London School of Economics, swore could predict a market correction with 96% accuracy. Forbes had run a cover story on him 2 months earlier. The headline called him the Blade. Not because he built anything, but because of how cleanly he cut through anyone standing between him and a deal. 3 hostile takeovers. 2,000 jobs eliminated in a single fiscal quarter, once, without a single public statement. A reputation, whispered but never printed, for humiliating junior analysts in front of their peers until they quit or broke. It had. Whitfield had built his empire on a single quiet belief, one he never said outright in interviews but funded think tank papers to imply: that intelligence was inherited, not earned, and that certain people were born with a ceiling. He had never once said it about Nadia specifically. He didn't have to. He'd been saying it to her all night with the way he snapped his fingers. 38 investors filled the private room. Hedge fund managers. 2 sitting congressmen's chiefs of staff. A retired federal judge named Arlen Whitcomb, seated at the head table, silent, watching everything the way judges do even when they're off the clock. It was the kind of room that measured a human being by net worth and zip code, and Nadia moved through it like smoke, replacing silverware, clearing plates, keeping her eyes on the floor. Early in the night, Whitfield snapped his fingers at her, without turning his head. More ice." She brought the ice. He didn't say thank you. 12 minutes later, she reached to clear a dessert plate, and he yanked his sleeve back from her hand, like she carried something contagious. "Don't touch me," he said. "I don't know where those hands have been." 3 men at his table laughed into their glasses. Nadia said nothing. She stepped back. She kept moving. "Remember the notebook. It matters later." Whitfield had set up a rolling whiteboard beside the head table, the centerpiece of the whole evening. 18 months of proprietary modeling, distilled into 4 dense equations meant to prove that Sentinel could see the next crash before it happened. 2 cameras streamed it live to a financial network with 400,000 subscribers. Whitfield wanted headlines. He wanted the applause. He had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror for a week. Nadia carried a tray of seared scallops past the whiteboard. She wasn't supposed to look. She looked anyway. And in the half-second her eyes crossed the 3rd equation, she saw it. A transposed variance term, buried in a covariance matrix, 3 lines deep, small enough that 11 PhDs had apparently missed it, or chosen not to see it. The kind of error that looked like nothing, and would cascade through every downstream projection until it inflated expected returns by nearly 22%. The kind of error that, if 38 people wired money into Sentinel tonight based on that board, would eventually cost someone their retirement. She set the tray down. She came back for a second look. It was still there. Every lesson her life had ever taught her said the same thing. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Survive the shift. Go home. But Nadia Coleman had never once in her life been able to walk past a wrong number and let it stand. She stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir. There's an error in your 3rd equation." That was the sentence that ended Marcus Whitfield's evening, though nobody in the room knew it yet, including him. The dare hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. $10 million. Live on camera, in front of a federal judge, and 2 congressional aides and 400,000 strangers watching from their phones. "Get me the marker," Nadia said quietly, "or I'll use my finger." A ripple of laughter, uncertain now, moved through the room because something in her voice had not asked for permission. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He tossed the dry erase marker onto the table rather than hand it to her. A small, calculated cruelty, forcing her to bend down and pick it up off the white linen in front of everyone. She picked it up. She didn't flinch. "The sigma and mu values in the variance term are switched," she said, uncapping the marker. "It's a transposition error. Small on paper, catastrophic in practice. Silence. The kind that presses on the eardrums. Whitfield laughed first, a short, dry bark, like a man clearing his throat before an insult. He turned to his guests, waiting for the room to laugh with him. Some of them did. A beat too late, the laughter of people checking each other's faces before committing to it. "Let's be clear," Whitfield said, folding his arms, stepping close enough that Nadia had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. "You. A woman who makes less in a year serving my scallops than I spend on a weekend in Aspen. You're telling me my team, Princeton, Caltech, LSE, got it wrong?" "I'm not talking about your team," Nadia said. "I'm talking about the number on the board. And what exactly qualifies you to talk about any number on any board?" His voice climbed, sharpened, found its audience. "Did you learn statistics scrubbing pots? Did somebody teach you probability theory between shifts at a car wash?" A woman near the window murmured to her husband, loud enough to carry the audacity. Her husband nodded, already reaching for his phone to text someone. Somebody call her manager. Nadia's hand did not shake. Her voice did not climb to meet his. "The transposition inflates your tail risk confidence interval by roughly 22%, she said. "Every investor in this room who commits capital tonight based on that board is making a decision on numbers that don't exist." The laughter stopped, not all at once. It drained out of the room the way blood drains from a face. A silver-haired man near the back, Franklin Doyle, managing partner of a family office worth 9 figures, a man who had sat through 400 pitch decks and trusted almost none of them, opened the laptop in front of him. His fingers moved across the keys. He frowned. He looked up, and this time he did not look at Whitfield. He looked at Nadia. Whitfield saw the shift happen, felt the room tilt a few degrees away from him, and that made it so much worse, because it meant this humiliation was no longer entirely under his control. A black waitress had made his room pause, even for 3 seconds, and Marcus Whitfield could not forgive that. He'd built an empire on never being the one who paused. "Get her manager," Whitfield snapped, louder now. "This is a private event. I want her out of this room in the next 90 seconds. That's when it should have ended. That's when most stories like this one do end." With the woman walking out the service door, apron balled up in her fist, another humiliation added to a stack she never had the luxury of putting down. It did not end there tonight. And you should know that going in. Because what happens over the next 20 minutes is worse for Marcus Whitfield than anything he has ever survived in a boardroom. The floor manager, a nervous man named Curtis Ames, who had worked for Whitfield's events company before, 3 separate times, before, hurried across the room already apologizing before he'd said a single word. "Mr. Whitfield, I am so sorry. She'll be terminated tonight, I promise you." "No," said a voice from the second table. It came from Owen Pratt, 29, the youngest analyst Whitfield employed, the only person in the room who had actually run the numbers on his own laptop instead of nodding along. He stood up, chair scraping the floor, his face pale. "She's right," Owen said. "I ran it. The variance term is inverted. If we deploy Sentinel with these parameters, we're telling investors their downside risk is a fraction of what it actually is." Whitfield turned on him with the same speed he'd turned on a hostile board 18 months earlier, the speed that had earned him his nickname. "Sit down, Owen. I'm not going to sit down and let 38 people wire money into a model I know is broken." The room had gone somewhere it had never gone before at one of Whitfield's events, somewhere unscripted. Judge Whitcomb set down his fork. He hadn't said a word all night, and he still didn't, but he was watching now with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 30 years learning to notice exactly when a room's story stopped being what its host wanted told. Whitfield's face had gone a shade of red that didn't photograph well, which mattered because 2 cameras were still rolling and 400,000 people were still watching. "Fine," he said, forcing something that wasn't quite a smile back onto his mouth. "Let's have some fun with the help. You corrected my equation. Congratulations. Solve this one." He grabbed a marker and, with a flourish meant to humiliate, wrote out a second, far more brutal problem across the clean side of the board. A stability bound from an open problem in metric space topology. The kind of question his own PhDs had told him privately was unsolved in the literature. A problem he'd only included in his slide deck as an intimidating flourish, never expecting anyone to actually attempt it. 10 million becomes 15 if you can crack that one in under an hour. And if you can't, you're finished in this city. I'll make sure no restaurant north of Canal Street hires you again. A gasp moved through the room. Even the investors who'd laughed earlier looked uneasy now, sensing they had crossed from spectacle into something closer to cruelty. Nadia looked at the board for a long moment. Long enough that Whitfield's smile started to return, thinking she'd back down. Thinking this was the moment she'd finally shrink, the way he expected people like her to shrink. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a 90-cent composition notebook, its cover soft and gray from years of handling, corners worn round. She set it on the table. She uncapped the marker. "Start the clock," she said. "Watch the notebook. It's about to become the only thing in that room nobody can argue with." For the next 38 minutes, Nadia Coleman filled 3 whiteboards with handwriting so dense and so certain that the cameramen stopped worrying about getting good shots of Whitfield and pointed both lenses at her instead. She worked the way she'd worked on the kitchen floor for a decade. Silent, unhurried, each line following the last with the inevitability of gravity. No leaps, no hand-waving, no apology for taking up space on a whiteboard that cost more than her monthly rent. Owen Pratt stood up first, craning to follow the proof. Then a woman near the front, one of the congressional aides, put both hands flat on the table as if bracing herself. Franklin Doyle had stopped typing entirely and simply watched, his mouth slightly open. Nobody in that room, watching Nadia's hand move across the board, had any idea that 411 miles away, at a small state university in Ohio, a professor named Dr. Ruth Callahan was pulling up the same live stream on her office laptop because a former student had texted her, "You need to see this right now." Dr. Callahan had spent 3 years of her career trying to prove exactly the bound. Nadia was now sketching in blue dry erase ink in front of 38 strangers who had no idea what they were watching. That's the kind of coincidence you remember for the rest of your life, if you're in that room. Most people never get to watch history happen from 6 feet away. At minute 38, Nadia wrote the final line, a single closed-form inequality, and underlined it twice. She set the marker down. She didn't turn around. She stood facing the board, breathing, ink still wet, and the room was so quiet you could hear the HVAC system humming through the ceiling vents. That silence is the first frozen moment. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Whitfield, who had spent his whole career filling silences with his own voice, said nothing, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what was about to happen next. And that terrified him more than any hostile board vote ever had. The video call, connecting Dr. Ruth Callahan to the room's projector screen, went live 30 seconds later, patched in by one of the camera technicians who'd recognized her name from the flood of messages in the livestream chat. Her face filled the second screen, 61 years old, silver hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up into it. She had walked Nadia's proof, line by line, while the room watched her watch it, her expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to disbelief. "This is correct," Dr. Callahan said, 2 words. But the way she said them, quietly, with something trembling underneath, landed like a verdict in a courtroom. "This is not only correct," she continued, her voice steadying even as her hands, visible at the edge of the frame, were not. "This is a novel proof. The approach, this reduction through metric space compactness, has never been published. It solves a problem I have spent 3 years failing to solve, along with 2 colleagues at MIT and 1 at Cambridge. She paused.
Where did you study?
I didn't, Nadia said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened all night. Then the room broke. Owen Pratt clapped first, once, twice, 3 times, and then the congressional aide joined, and then Franklin Doyle, and then it was 10 people. Then it was all 38, standing, applauding, some of them with their hands pressed together hard enough to whiten the knuckles. A woman near the ice sculpture, the same one who'd laughed an hour earlier, was crying now, tears running down her face, watching a waitress in a stained apron do something she'd been told, her whole educated life, that people who looked like Nadia simply could not do. The live stream chat exploded. 2 million messages in 90 seconds. The words "who is she" repeating like a heartbeat. The hashtag climbing into trending lists across 14 countries within the hour. Nadia turned and looked at Marcus Whitfield. He was sitting now, though nobody remembered him sitting down. His hands were in his lap. His face had gone the color of wet concrete. The swagger, the $41 billion certainty that had carried him into every room of his life, without ever once doubting his own place in it, gone, in the space of 38 minutes and 1 small woman with a 90-cent notebook. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. "You asked if I could count past the number of plates I carry," she said quietly, glancing at the 3 whiteboards behind her, dense with her own handwriting from edge to edge. "I can." But this is not the part where the story lets Marcus Whitfield off easy. This is the part where it gets worse for him, on camera, in front of everyone, because cruelty like his never travels alone. Judge Arlen Whitcomb stood, unhurried, the way men stand, who have never once in their lives needed to raise their voice to be heard. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I sat on the federal bench for 19 years. I know a fraudulent representation when I watch one made live in front of me. That third equation you presented as your firm's proprietary model, the one this young woman corrected. Do you know how I know it wasn't an honest mistake?" Whitfield said nothing. His mouth had gone thin and flat. "Because I asked your own analyst here." The judge nodded toward Owen Pratt. "Before this happened, whether Sentinel had been independently audited. He told me no. You've been raising capital on an internal model nobody outside your building has verified, and tonight, in front of 2 live cameras, an outsider found in 90 seconds an error your 11 PhDs either missed or buried." He turned toward the back of the room. "Mr. Vance, I believe this concerns you." A man in a charcoal suit rose from the second table. Desmond Vance, a securities attorney who had spent the entire evening silent, watching, taking notes on a legal pad instead of his phone. "Mr. Whitfield," Vance said, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmur. "You made a public wager, live, in front of over 400,000 viewers and 38 accredited investors, several of whom I represent. You offered $15 million if this woman solved a problem you presented as unsolvable. She solved it. You also just heard from a federal judge an implication that your model was never independently verified before tonight's capital solicitation. I'd strongly advise you to honor the wager, on camera, right now, before this becomes a Securities and Exchange Commission matter instead of an embarrassing headline." The room had gone quiet again, a different kind of quiet now, a legal kind. Whitfield looked at Vance. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the 400,000 people, climbing towards 600,000 by the minute, watching him from the other side of 2 lenses that had never once, in his career, caught him losing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. His hand did not shake, but his jaw did. He wrote the check in silence, $15 million, and tore it free without looking at Nadia when he held it out. "I clearly underestimated you," he said. It was not an apology. It landed nowhere near enough. but it was the closest thing to an honest sentence Marcus Whitfield had spoken all night. "Most people do," Nadia said. She folded the check once and slid it into the same apron pocket where she kept her order pad and her 80-cent pen. The notebook's twin, the one she'd carried every shift for 3 years without anyone ever asking what was in it. You'd think that was the end of Marcus Whitfield's night. It wasn't, and this is the part where the story stops being about a wager and starts being about a pattern. While the room was still buzzing, while Owen Pratt was pulling files onto a shared drive to protect himself, Franklin Doyle raised his hand and asked, quietly, whether this was the first time an analyst had flagged a problem with Whitfield's models and been overruled. Owen didn't answer right away. Then he said carefully that 2 junior analysts had raised concerns about an earlier fund 18 months ago and had both been let go within a month, cited for cultural fit. He said it like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying alone for a long time. A second voice followed. A compliance officer named Priya Nair, seated near the back, who had said nothing all evening and looked, for a moment, like she wished she could stay that way. But Judge Whitcomb's eyes found her, and something about the stillness of the room made silence feel like its own kind of lie. "There was a formal complaint filed 14 months ago," Priya said finally, her voice low, "about Sentinel's backtesting methodology. It went to Mr. Whitfield's office directly. It was never escalated to the board." She looked down at her hands. "I should have said something sooner. I told myself it wasn't my place." Nobody clapped for that confession. It wasn't that kind of moment. But something in the room shifted anyway. The particular discomfort of 38 people, realizing they had all, in their own ways, chosen comfort over the truth, until a waitress with a 90-cent notebook made comfort impossible to choose any longer. Marcus Whitfield did not apologize to Billionaire. He did not apologize to Owen Pratt. Standing there with his checkbook back in his jacket, he said only, "This is a private matter, and I'll be discussing it with counsel," which is the sentence powerful men say when they intend to admit nothing at all, ever, to anyone, and mean to survive this the way they've survived everything else. He would not get to. Not this time. Dr. Ruth Callahan, still on the projector screen, cleared her throat, and the room turned back to her. "I want to say something to Miss Coleman, and I want the cameras to catch it," she said. "What you just demonstrated is not a party trick. It is not a lucky guess. And it is not something anyone learns from a few library books. Though God knows you did more with those library books than most of my doctoral students do with 4 years of tuition." A small, unpolished laugh moved through the room, the first real one all night. "I am offering you a full research fellowship, effective immediately. Tuition, housing, a research stipend, and a place in my lab. I have spent 3 years failing at the problem you just solved on a rented whiteboard in a restaurant. I would be lucky to have you." Nadia's hand went to her mouth. She didn't speak. For a moment, 27 years of not being seen caught up with her all at once, and she simply stood there, breathing, blue ink still drying on her fingers, in an apron that had never once in 3 years and 8 months felt as heavy as it did now, though for the first time, it wasn't from exhaustion. That's the second frozen moment. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke over her. The room simply let her have it. Franklin Doyle approached first once the applause had faded, offering his card, saying he funded real scholarships, not wagers, and that he wanted to talk Monday about setting one up in her mother's name. Owen Pratt handed her his card too, quieter, said only, "I should have spoken up an hour before I did. I'm sorry. It took someone as brave as you to make me do it." 2 more investors followed. Cards out, hands extended, faces nothing like the ones that had laughed 90 minutes earlier. Marcus Whitfield sat alone at the head table while all of it happened around him, not because anyone had asked him to leave yet, but because for the first time in his adult life, nobody in a room he'd paid for was looking at him at all. The live stream ended 2 hours later with just under 2.1 million concurrent viewers. The clip of Nadia saying "I didn't" when asked where she'd studied was viewed 43 million times in the first 24 hours. It was shared by professors, by a former WNBA player, by a news anchor in Atlanta, and by a 15-year-old boy in the Bronx who posted it with 3 words: "That's my sister." 6 weeks later, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal inquiry into Whitfield Dynamics Capital's backtesting disclosures, built substantially on Billionaire's testimony, and the compliance file she finally handed over in full. Whitfield Dynamics lost 40% of its assets under management within the quarter, as institutional investors quietly pulled out, unwilling to be associated with a firm now trending for the wrong reasons. Marcus Whitfield stepped down as CEO in a 2-paragraph statement that used the word unprecedented and never once used the word sorry. He kept his money. He kept his apartment on Fifth Avenue. He did not, according to 2 people who worked closely with him afterward, ever fully admit that the fault had been his own, rather than simply bad luck and a room full of people who'd turned on him too fast. That refusal, the small, stubborn, permanent refusal to say the one true sentence that might have repaired something, is the part of him that never changed, and it is, in its own way, the harshest sentence he was ever handed. 6 months after that night, Nadia Coleman sat in the front row of a lecture hall at MIT, in a building with her name now printed on a fellowship plaque near the entrance, funded in her mother's name by Franklin Doyle. Her first paper, on stability bounds in persistent homology, was accepted by a peer-reviewed journal that 3 of Dr. Callahan's own doctoral advisors had published in during their careers. The reviewers called it a landmark contribution to the field. She still carries the notebook. It's not the same one. That one sits framed on a shelf in Dr. Callahan's office at Nadia's own quiet insistence, a 90-cent object that nobody in that lab will ever throw away. But she keeps a new one now, filled front to back, then flipped over, started again. Some habits aren't about scarcity anymore. Some habits are just who you are. The kitchen floor is gone. The cracked phone is gone. The apron hangs in a closet in an apartment near Cambridge that her brother, now 16, visits on school breaks, sleeping on a real bed for the first time in either of their lives. Some people wait their whole lives for the world to see them clearly. Nadia Coleman didn't wait. She picked up a marker, and she made an entire room look. I keep coming back to this story because I think about how many Nadias are out there right now, carrying trays, mopping floors, solving equations nobody will ever hand them a whiteboard for. Talent has never once checked a person's zip code or the color of their skin before deciding where to live. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who's been made to feel invisible in a room they belonged in. Tell them in the comments about a time someone underestimated you and what it felt like the day they were wrong. And if a story like this deserves to keep finding the people who need to hear it, you know what to do.